Hello my friends, and welcome to my second Christmas video of the season, where I'm going to give a new look to a thrift store bucket and a piece of scrap wood. I love the vintage Santa look. I hope you do too, and we'll stay tuned to see how I did this. It is Create Day, so let's get started. I'm starting off with this piece of scrap wood that I have already sanded down, and it measures approximately 12 inches long by 6 inches across. I'm applying a coat of Mod Podge as my first step here. I've seen other people do a crackle effect using like Elmer's glue, and there's a certain amount of waiting for it to get tacky but not completely dry. And I came upon this just kind of accidentally on a previous project where I had put the Mod Podge down and it was completely dried, and when I painted over it, I got the crackle effect just like you would if you used the other glue. So I thought I would go ahead and do that with this one. Once that Mod Podge was dried, I applied a coat of white acrylic paint, and now I'm using my heat tool just to kind of speed up the drying and get a little bit of that crackle started. This isn't, like a fine line crackle necessarily like you would get with crackle products, but it makes it distressed enough that you can go in with a piece of sandpaper. I'm using my finger sander to just kind of work at that and expose more of the wood underneath, and here's how it turns out. I think this is a great distressed look on the cheap. I'm going to use a transfer from IOD's Figgy Pudding collection. I think this one's a couple of years old, and I still hadn't used this adorable little vintage, kind of like a Nordic Santa. So I just taped him in place there when I got him in the position I wanted, and then using the transfer tool, I'm going to just rub this transfer on here. To make a couple of trim pieces, I've mixed up some of my amazing resin, and I'm using one of the little molds on, I think this is a redesign mold that I got from Amazon. I will leave the link, if I can find it, for that in the description box, along with everything else that I can leave links for. And it sets up really quickly, and when it's still fresh, it's pliable enough that you can cut it to fit the size of your project. So I'm going to trim up both pieces. I'm going to have one on the top and one on the bottom. While I'm waiting those to finish setting up, I'm going to use IOD's Adornment Stamp and my Stays On ink in Timber Brown. I'm going to put this stamp on the top and the bottom as well, and then I will be putting my trim pieces lined up with the stamp. I always test out my stamps first on a paper towel just to see if I'm getting enough ink on there or if I'm getting too much, just to kind of give me an idea of how much I need to put on there. For my trim pieces, I'm using DIY's Layered Chocolate to give my first coat of paint, and then I will be dry brushing over this color to bring out all those details. I'm using the DuraClear Ultramatte Sealer to seal in my board all the way around, front, back, top, and sides. I'm going to use this same sealer on those trim pieces because they do have that DIY paint on there that needs to be sealed. And then I am going to attach a hanging system on the back before I apply those castings. I'm just using a little sawtooth hanger. I got this from Amazon, and I'm just going to mark my little spots where I need to drill my holes for the screws and get that attached. The first color I'm going to use for my dry brushing is called Burlap. I like to start with the darker colors and then work my way up to the lightest. I just feel like it gives it a lot more interest that way. So I'm just, offloading most of my paint and then brushing over all those high spots. I'm going to repeat that step with a color called Linen. Now I'm using a color called Light Mocha, and then the final paint will be the white acrylic. I'm attaching those trim pieces with my Titebond Quick and Thick, and unfortunately this is out of frame. I didn't realize that until it was too late. But all I'm doing is just gluing them down. You can see the one that's set on top there. I just had it set in place. I hadn't glued it down yet. Now I'm gluing that one down. But you can see I'm gluing these down. The bottom piece is on top of that stamp, and the top piece is underneath the stamp. I cut out this song title from a music book, and I'm going to trim these down to size. I wanted to, kind of cut in half so I could make two different little pieces here. And first, once I have those trimmed down, I'm going to use my Vintage Photo Distress Oxide ink around the edges, and a little bit on the front. And then I'm going to be cutting that piece of burlap ribbon to size, just a little bit bigger than my little pieces of paper. And then I will attach the paper onto the ribbon with some Fabri-Tac glue. I'm going to crumple these up a little bit so they have a little bit more of a vintage look. I'm attaching them to my board with that same Fabri-Tac glue, and that will complete this project. This one was pretty simple and a lot of fun to make. Let me know what you think in the comments. For project number 2, I've got this nice galvanized bucket from the thrift store. It has this design on here, and I felt like if I painted over it, it would probably, you would still see it, like it would be raised just enough that you could still make out the design. So I did take it out to the garage and sand all that off of there. Then I gave it a coat of my matte clear sealer. I'm using IOD's Santa Sleigh for this one. This is new this year. And I'm using my DAS air dry clay. I'm going to do the Santa Sleigh first, and then I will be doing the reindeer. I'm just going to put this clay, now this is a fairly big mold, so resin might be a better choice depending on your project. This was really hard to scrape off of there with my little scraper because it wasn't wide enough to catch all those edges. But it turned out okay, and I like to pick this thing up with that little scraper and then just get my finger wet and smooth down all those edges. Then I'm going to apply my Titebond Quick and Thick and glue this on the front of the bucket. offsetting it to the left side. And I actually put it up a little too high. I almost couldn't get that reindeer on there because I did not plan ahead enough for this. And again, if you were using resin, you could line them up first and get the position you want. And since I was using clay, I did not do that. Now with my reindeer, he came out okay. I was really worried about the antlers. The only part that broke off was his bottom leg piece. You can see it right there. But you can just reattach that, so it's not a big deal. I'm cleaning up the edges on this one, and then I will glue him onto the bucket too. I let these set up for a couple of hours so that glue was good and dry, and then I came in with my paint, which is DIY's Crinoline. I'm going to start painting the casting first, trying to get that down into all those little details so everything's completely covered. And then from there, I will go ahead and paint this bucket. And I'm going to paint the whole thing, outside and inside and bottom. And I'm going to do, the first coat is just with the brush. And then I'm going to mix in some salt wash with that paint and stipple that on to give a textured look that will especially help around the edges of those castings to fill in the gaps. Here's the salt wash. And I'm going to mix this half and half with my paint. And again, using a kind of a round pointy brush, I can get a really good textured effect by stippling with that. And I do use a small brush to go in around the smaller sections around those castings, like right here. It's just easier to get in those tiny spots with a smaller brush. I'm doing that same process on the inside of the bucket as well. This, of course, this took a little more time, but I just really didn't want the brush strokes on this one. I wanted the texture instead, and I've just flipped that over onto the handles and do the bottom. When that was dry, I sealed it with my Duraclear matte varnish. I'm taking raw umber acrylic craft paint, spritzing in some water to get this watered down to use it kind of like a glaze. I'm going to mix that in and then start spreading it onto those castings, getting it down into the depths of the details, and then I can wipe back the excess on off the tops of the casting to just kind of leave that sitting down into the recessed areas. And since this is all sealed, if you make a boo-boo and get it on the container instead of your casting, you can just wipe that off with a baby wipe. Just get it before it dries. Then I just did the same thing with the reindeer. I wanted to freshen up those little wood handles, so I'm going to sand those down the best I can, and then I will apply some waxes to them. I'm using Dixie Belle's Van Dyke Brown Glaze to go over the entire bucket around those castings, brushing it on and wiping it back with a baby wipe. Now, if you want it to be more white, like just a stark contrast between the castings and the bucket, then you wouldn't want to do this step. I'm on the fence. I kind of had envisioned more white. Even though I wiped a lot of this back, it was still just a little bit darker than I wanted, but it went with the castings pretty well, so it's all good. Then on the bottom I ended up doing two coats because I wanted the bottom to actually be darker than the rest of the bucket. Then I decided to make a little label, so I'm using the IOD Conservatory labels mold. And this would have been much easier to do this when I did the other castings, but I thought of it after the fact. I just did that one little mold, and I'm going to use my Apothecary labels, also from IOD, to imprint on that wet clay Saint Nick. I love using stamps for this type of thing. It just looks so neat to me to have that indentation on there, and then you can highlight it with paint or whatever, glaze or whatever you're using. I'm going to go ahead and attach that with the Titebond Quick and Thick. And here's where I messed up. I'm painting that brown paint on there, but I missed a step. I did not paint it with the Crinoline first. So you can see I can't really wipe that off very well. I got a lot of it off, but not enough. So I did go back in. Once that had dried, I went in with that Crinoline and painted it and basically just started over. Then going back in when that was dry with the brown, and then the Van Dyke brown glaze around the edges, just like I did the other castings. So now back to the handles. This is my Jolie finishing wax in clear. I'm going to apply this, wipe it back with a soft lint-free cloth, and then I will add my antiquing wax. Now I'm using Grecian Gold Rub and Buff to highlight my castings, and this particular one came with this little sponge applicators that I'm trying out for the first time to see if they are helpful. Because usually I use my finger, but I thought on some of these smaller details that would really be difficult. And so these did really come in handy. I'm glad I have them. Those were from Amazon, and I will leave the link for those as well. I'm using this Rub and Buff to highlight all those raised areas, trying to not get it down on any of the recessed ones, and trying to also not go too overboard with it, just bringing everything out so that it's noticeable. And I'm also going to use this to go around the top rim of the bucket as well. I have this little stencil that I got from Amazon. I want to use the stars. So I trimmed that down so it would fit up underneath that rim. And I'm actually using that same Rub and Buff to do this. I didn't know if it was going to work very well. I've never used Rub and Buff for a stencil. But surprisingly, it really didn't give me much problem and went on just fine, even on that textured surface. So I just put 3 little simple stars, and now we are going to attach our reins. For the reins, I'm using this paper covered wire, gluing one end onto where his hands are and then running it up to the back of the head, and then putting the other piece kind of right under his chin and running that back to Santa's hands as well. I thought it would be super cute if you had a little piece of leather that was super tiny and thin that would work for that. I think that would be so much cuter. But I like the paper covered wire. It worked out great. And here's where I'm just doing that Rub and Buff on the top edges. So now I need to make the dreadful bow. I'm using this beautiful green velvet ribbon from Hobby Lobby. I do not succeed at making bows, so just keep that in mind. I cut 2 strips to make 2 loops, hot gluing them together to make each loop. And then you're supposed to, put the smaller one on top, scrunch them together, and tie them with either zip tie or pipe cleaner, or in my case, floor wire. It was so difficult. This ribbon is thick and it's wired, so it was really difficult. I decided that it just wasn't big enough, like the bottom piece was too short. So I made another one and I decided to scrunch them separately. I thought that would be a lot easier for my arthritic hands to deal with. And that did seem to work a lot better. So then I did attach the smaller top one on top. Everything's been pre-scrunched and wired. And then I can just attach those two together with a longer wire that I can also use to attach this to that bucket. Now I cover up that wire in the center there just by cutting another strip and then folding that into thirds. So I'm going to glue that together so that it's small enough to go around that center piece and not come unraveled by cutting it. And then I can just glue that strip around the center of that bow and hot glue it in place on the back. And then I realized that I forgot to add the tails before I glued that on there. So now I'm going to add these after the fact. I just glued that strip in half at the center point, just in the middle. And then I folded them down and hot glued that onto the back of my bow. Then I cut my little dovetails. And then I decided to add some little embellishments on the front of this, just with some picks I had left over. They're just the little red pip berries and pine cones. I glued a little, stem of those into each side of that center piece. And now I'm going to go ahead and attach this to my bucket with that extended piece of floral wire that I left on there. Then I can cut that off and tuck under any sharp little edges so nobody gets hurt. And then I can just kind of fiddle around and fluff that up to get it looking as full as possible. That will be it for this one. Before we take a final look, I want to say thank you so very much for joining me here today. I really do appreciate each and every one of you. I hope you find my content useful. Will give me a thumbs up. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. But more importantly, I hope I've inspired you to go create something. See you next time.